Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. And I'm seeing you once again with lecture 28 of novel 2, that is modern novel. In today's talk, we are going to continue our discussion on themes and critical questions. And we will also bring in our discussion the talk about symbolism and imagery and allegory in the story. We will continue with our critical reflection based on the entire discussion we could have had so far on the narrative, and I'll also include some statements from the text to bring into your notice so you can use them when you are needing some references from the text to substantiate your answer. Discussion based on characters sketch will also be a part of today's talk if we are able to spare some time. So starting with the themes of the narrative, A Passage to India. The first theme of today's discussion is theme of contrasting regions. Now, A Passage to India turns again and again to India as a country so vast, so diverse, and so exotic that it cannot be fathomed by the puny human mind. India is contrasted with England, which is presented as a small, charming island that doesn't overwhelm you with its neat valleys and lakes. England is homey and familiar. India is uncanny and strange. England is modern, progressive, civilized. India is both primitive and infinitely more civilized, bearing the ruins of numerous ancient and modern civilizations. In the novel, even the India characters have trouble grasping what India is all about. So, the mysterious Malabar caves stand in for India as a whole, as a representation of the exoticness and mysteriousness of the land, an entity that is certainly extraordinary but about which not much can be said. The novel itself seems torn between championing India's rich history and disparaging its muddled history, diversity. Well, what can be questions that would raise into your minds regarding this contrasting regions theme in A Passage to India? You should think about that how is India as a country represented in the novel, and what makes it different, what makes its representation different from the other end, that is England. What are some of the characteristics of its geography, its landscape, and its cities? That will be very helpful when you'll be watching the visual provided along with the set, and also the clips are included in the discussions as well. So there is no doubt that the narrative itself is quite explanatory and detailed in its nature, but the visualized version in the shape of the movie will help you a lot in answering this question. How are English characters affected by their experience of India? What does India do to their state of mind, their emotions, the way they look at the world? How is India depicted as foreign, exotic, and different from England is the total nutshell question that includes all of them. So these are some questions that I would like you to think about in the background of this theme, and how can you answer them? Well, a little suggestion when you are working for these questions. A Passage to India attempts to encompass the vast cultural and geographical diversity of India, at the same time that it constantly reminds the reader of fertility of such a project. Forster's novel consistently represents India as alien that is virtually unpresentable to the Western mind. So, this was the last bit of theme that was left in the discussion, and now we are going to touch the symbolism, use of imagery and allegory in the narrative by Forster, by E.M. Forster in A Passage to India. Apparently, we see four symbols very prominent in the narrative, and they are divided into four categories. One category is of social occasions, where you will find parties, picnics and festivals giving you a flavor of the culture and moods and attitudes of people who are making that culture happening. Then second bit is categorized as the religious physical structures such as mosque, cave, temple, and a few comments on the weather as well, because that contributes in this category of symbolism as well. Then you will find the sky. The sky is another symbol or imagery somewhere that gives a meaning or adds meaning into already developed meaning categories. And then nothingness or nothing. That is the fourth category. Starting with the very first category, that is of social occasions, A Passage to India may well read like a series of bad parties. We see parties such as the Turton's Bridge Party, Fielding's Tea Party, and Aziz's Picnic Party. All of these occasions are supposed to be about coming together, getting closer, making some friends and having a good time, a good social interaction, but all of them fail miserably. In the novel, these failed parties serve as allegories for the British Empire in general in India. That is what the writer wants to symbolize. The British Empire as a dude party, if you ask it, well, the novel shows that each of these occasions fail because of the British need for exclusion, for hierarchies, for social boundaries, and for establishing an us versus them that always sets up an us as superior to them as inferior. Racism is an extension of this desire for exclusion, and so it is empire which is based on the principle that we are better, more civilized, more modern, more powerful than them. And who is we and who is them should be quite clear by now. Aziz's catastrophe of a picnic is just a spectacular instance of how destructive the British desire for exclusion can be. But this desire for exclusion isn't confined to the British alone. The novel opens as a Muharram, a Muslim festival approaches during the trial. The Muharram riots were associated with demonstrations in support of Aziz. So you will see that this desire of exclusion or individuality does not only relate to British Empire only in the novel by E.M. Forster. So before the trial, however, the Muharram troubles referred to the inevitable tangles between the Muslims and the Hindus about the parade route. The Muharram riots are an allegory for the religious factionalism that continues to threaten the South Asian subcontinent to this very day. In contrast to these failed social occasions, take a peek at the Gokul Ashtami festival, which is a festival set up to fail. That's a Hindu festival. We mean fail in the sense of failing to exclude anyone. The festival celebrates all beings, excluding no one and nothing, not even the tiniest of bugs or the silliest of jokes. In his religious trance, God Bole doesn't get in touch with some higher power. He remembers an old woman, that is Mrs. Moore, back in Chandrapur, and a wasp. So we see somehow E.M. Forster is trying to support Hinduism for this vision that it doesn't exclude anyone, or it does not have the spirit of exclusion. Well, however, how far this is true, you are to analyze this. The second category is of mosque, cave and temple, and few comments about the weather as well. You might have noticed that the novel is not only divided up into chapters, but it is also divided into 3 parts entitled Mosque, Cave and Temple. The parts are also organized by the 3 seasons in India. Mosque takes place during the cool weather, cave during the hot weather, and temple during the rainy season. So clearly the novel has 3 distinctions of religious structures as well as of weathers. These parts divisions set the tone for the events described in each part. In Mosque, the first part of the novel, Aziz reference to the architecture of the mosque is that of call and response, harmonizes with the general tenor of this part of the novel, where people are meeting each other and at various social functions. Like the cool weather, people are generally calm and friendly. In contrast, the cave section of the novel contains the climax of the novel. It's taking place during the hot weather, emotions are inflamed, and nobody seems to be able to think coolly and calmly and rationally, just as Mrs. Moore's hold on life was threatened by her experience of meaninglessness within the cave. The entire community of Chandapur is turned upside down as riots and unrest surround the trial. Finally, the final section, the temple section, attempts to wash away the chaos of the cave section with its pouring rains. In keeping with the Hindu motif of the temple, the chapter celebrates the Hindu principle of the oneness of all things with God Bole and the Gokul Ashtami festival, and provides us with a reconciliation, though a tenuous one, between Fielding and Aziz. And now the fourth category is of nothing at all. In a twist that God Bole would surely appreciate, nothing in the novel is actually something. That is, it's a symbol of nothing. The novel begins with the word nothing in its first sentence. You might have noticed that the novel seems obsessed with gaps and holes. The novel is roughly structured like a donut with a big hole where Adela's experience in the cave should be. But if you think about it, even though nothing is written about Adela's experience in the cave, it doesn't mean that nothing happened or that nothing can be said. In fact, it's probably the most interesting part of the book precisely because it's missing. As the narrator comments on the Malabar caves, which are just a big series of holes, they are extraordinary. The extraordinariness, if that's even a word of nothing, one of the most mysterious and certainly compelling motifs in the novel. And then the category of the sky. The sky recurs in chapter after chapter, sometimes personified to the extent that this depiction of the sky almost becomes characters in their own right. The sky as the entity that embraces all things could be contrasted as a symbol of inclusiveness, but it has also been read as a symbol of the vast expanse of entire British imperial control, or the inconceivable vastness of India itself. So this was a discussion about different categories of symbols, imageries and allegories. Now what we are going to bring in our discussion about critical reflection. What happened to Adela in the cave? a few theories are thrown around in the novel, because this is the gist of the novel. This is what that sets the mood of the entire story. Either Adela hallucinated, the guide did it, or a random villager did it. Do any of these theories work for you? Can you come up with a more satisfactory one which would have satisfactory references from the text as well? Because this is very important. If you could understand it and as well as explain it, that means you could really grasp the story. Foster said of Adela's experience in the cave, and he says, and I quote, "When asked about what happened there, I don't know." How would the novel be different if Foster wrote out what happened to Adela in the cave? And why doesn't he show us how Mrs. Moore actually died? How successful do you think the novel is in its critique of Orientalist stereotypes? Do you think the novel still clings to some of these racial stereotypes when it depicts Indian characters? Well, for that matter, you need to understand what are stereotypes and you need to understand what is Orientalism. So, I give you this assignment of looking for the meanings and understanding of these terms and then try to answer this question. The novel's title suggests that passages are critical to the novel. Certainly one way of thinking of the title is that the passage to India is Adela's, or perhaps the passage that all of the English characters take to India. What are some other passages to India in the book? You need to figure out. In what sense can we understand some of the Indian characters as taking a passage to India, either to an independent India or to the India of a real India, is the question to be explored. So, now some questions need some detail for discussion, and these questions should be your focus of attention as well. And the very first that we are going to discuss is, what do Adela and Mrs. Moore hope to get out of their visit to India? Do they succeed if they could figure out their intention? That is the question. From the outset, both Mrs. Moore and Adela assert that their desire is to see the real India while they are in the country. Both women are frustrated with the lack of interaction between the English and the Indians, and they hope to get an authentic view of India rather than the standard tour for visiting colonials. Of the two, Mrs. Moore is less vocal than Adela in her impatience to discover the spirit of India, and she seems to be provisionally more successful in her goal than Adela. While Adela mops in the Chandrapur club, Mrs. Moore is already out on her own meeting Aziz in the mosque. Mrs. Moore, it seems, gets closer to a real sense of India because she seeks it out within Indians themselves, approaching them with sincere sympathy and interest. She does not desire to learn facts about Indian culture, but to forge a personal, individual connection. Adela, on the other hand, does not look to Indians for a glimpse of the real India. Instead, she operates in a somewhat academic vein, going around and trying to gather information and impressions of the country. Adela wishes to get in contact with the spirit behind the fries of India, but she skips the step in between. Rather than regard Indians as people like herself, she seems to view them as subjects for intellectual study. Ultimately, both women largely fail in their quest to see the real India. Adela is thwarted before she even begins. Her engagement to Ronnie forces her to give up her quest for communication with India and to take her place among the ranks of the rest of the English women in Chandrapur. Mrs. Moore, at least, realizes her mistaken quest before leaving India. On her train ride back to the coast to catch a return ship to England, Mrs. Moore begins to understand that she and Adela have both been misguided in their search for a single India. Mrs. Moore realizes that India exists in hundreds of ways and that it cannot be fathomed by a single mind or in a single visit. It cannot be captured. Another question that demands your attention is that what causes Adela's breakdown? Why does she accuse Aziz at all? Knowing Aziz very well and his attitude and his nature, what qualities enable her to admit the truth at the trial then in the end? What is that she is so sure about that makes her forget about her own future and think about Aziz as a matter of fact? We know that Adela is an intelligent and inquisitive girl, but she has a limited world view and is, as Fielding puts it, a prig. That is because of the fact that she couldn't leave England before her visit to India, and this was the very first visit in her life out of England. Adela has come to India to experience an adventure and to gauge her desire to marry Ronnie. During the early stages of the visit, she weights both her emotions and her experiences with an almost clinical precision. Adela wants to see the real India, which apparently means an India unfiltered through the lens of English people and colonial institutions. But in her desire to have a single authentic experience and a single authentic understanding of India, Adela is unable to take in the complexity of her surroundings, which have been muddled even further by the presence of the English. There is no real India. There are 100 real Indians. But Adela's attempt to make her Indian experience match her comfortable preconceptions cannot prepare her for this fact. As the muddle of India slowly works its way into her mind, it undermines her perceptions without giving her anything with which to replace them. So on the way to the Malabar caves, Adela realizes for the first time that she does not love Ronnie. The sheer incomprehensibility of experience, as represented by the echoes in the caves, overwhelms her for the first time. Traumatized Adela feels not only as though her world is breaking down, but as though India itself is responsible for the breakdown. This idea solidifies in her mind as the idea that Aziz, an Indian, has attacked and attempted to rape her. Still, Adela is committed to the truth and has a strong mind when she sees Aziz at the trial. She re-enters the scene in her mind in a sort of disembodied vision. She realizes that her actions are running a real person's life. They are ruining a real person's life, and she is therefore able to pull back and withdraw her charge before a verdict can be handed down. So, another important question that comes into my mind after going through this discussion is that what purpose does part 3, that is temple, play in a passage to India? Well, is it some kind of religious comparison going on or regional contrast going on? Well, you are to explore, and there are some suggestions for it. The first issue that Foster addresses in a passage to India is whether or not an Englishman and an Indian can be friends. Part 1 and 2 of the novel depict the friendship of Aziz and Feeling, first on the accident and then as it breaks apart. Part 2 leaves us with a pessimistic sense that cross-cultural communication is futile and that such friendships cause more hurt than good. Part 3, however, gives us a measured resolution to this issue. In this final section of the novel, Fielding and Aziz meet again after 2 years and resolve their misunderstandings, though not their differences. Foster shows that while outside forces can make cross-cultural friendships nearly impossible, the friendships themselves, whether successful or not, are still a valuable experience. The pessimistic ending of Part 2 is thus tempered by Foster's depiction of Aziz and Feeling in Part 1 and in Part 3. Additionally, Foster's use Part 3 to address the issue of how a foreigner can best understand and make peace with the muddle of India. Throughout parts 1 and 2, Foster shows several main characters, Mrs. Moore, Adela, Feeling, experiencing spiritual crisis in the face of the chaos of Indian experience. And Part 3, which is set in the Hindu state of Mayu during a Hindu religious festival, offers the Hindu vision of the oneness of all living things as a possible answer to the problem of comprehending India. The most mystical characters of the novel take the spotlight in Part 3. God Bole serves in Mayu as an educator and religious figure as well, and Mrs. Moore reappears through her 2 children, Ralph and Stella. If Foster is pessimistic about Fielding and Aziz's friendship in Part 3, he at least offers the collectivity of Hindu love as a potential source of hope and redeeming possibility. And this was all about the critical reflections, and now we are going to move into some statements from the text and their explanations. Alright, the very first reference that we are going to discuss is, in every remark, Aziz found a meaning, but not always the true meaning, and his life, though vivid, was largely a dream. This quotation occurs in chapter 7 during Aziz and Fielding's first meeting at Fielding's house, just before the tea party. Fielding has just made a brief comment in which he meant that the post-impressionist school of painting, to which Aziz has just made joking reference, is obscure and silly. Aziz, however, takes Fielding's comments to mean that it is silly for Aziz to have Western cultural knowledge. Aziz's embarrassment and discontent does not last long in this instance, but the incident foreshadows the misunderstandings that eventually break down the men's friendship. Aziz's capacity for imagination and intuition leads him to genuine and deep friendships with Mrs. Moore and Fielding. However, Foster also shows that Aziz's intuition, which lacks grounding in fact, can lead him astray. And this is very important to understand. In the aftermath of his trial, Aziz Fall's hunch that Fielding is courting Adela quested leads to the breakdown of the men's relationship and friendship. In the above quotation and in the recently discussed quotation, an early case of this false intuition, we see that Forster's lays the blame for the breakdown on Aziz. Forster's does not fault the difficulties of cross-cultural interaction, but rather Aziz's overactive imagination. This flaw in Aziz's character, in a sense, also stands for a flaw of India itself. Forster presents Aziz's attitudes towards others as unfounded in reality. Cut off from a logical cause, Aziz's responses damage relationships rather than build them. This cut-off quality is later mirrored in a very landscape of India. The land around the Marabar caves, described in chapter from 8 to 12, appears cut off at its root and infected with illusions. Forster presents India and Aziz as somewhat threatening to the logical and reasonable apprehensions and reaction to reality that the author sees as epitomized by Western order. This type of narrative comment that diagnoses Aziz's character is characteristic of Forster's writing, mainly. So when you are asked about the style of Forster's, E.M. Forster's narrative, this kind of narrative comments will stand as a unique aspect of his writing. The author is concerned with presenting actions and dialogue, but he also seeks to draw comparisons and distinctions to categorize and characterize. Indeed, Forster tells and comments as much as he shows. Still, not all Forster's narrative diagnosis can be taken as absolute truth that stands throughout the novel. Though Forster depicts Aziz's imaginativeness as a handicap here, in other sense, we see that Forster values it. Fielding did not even want to correct Aziz. He had dulled his craving for verbal truth and cared chiefly for truth of mood. As for Miss Quested, she accepted everything Aziz said as truly verbal. In her ignorance, she regarded him as India and never surmised that his outlook was limited and his method inaccurate, and that no one is, in fact, real India. This passage, occurring at Fielding's tea party later in chapter 7 and 8, highlights a major distinction between the English and the Indians. Forster shows that Indians value the emotion and purpose behind a statement more than the literal words being stated. Indeed, we see that Aziz often tells lies, or at least lies by English standards, that are nonetheless truthful to Aziz himself, though, because they reflect his desire to be hospitable or because they serve to keep a conversation progressing smoothly, but they are still lies. Similarly, other Indians, such as the Nawab Bahadur, give elaborate speeches that seem to have no coherent point, but that serve to rescue the other party from disgrace or impoliteness, whereas the Indian seems to favor indirect speech. The English value statements primarily on the basis of literal truth. The English are, as a matter of fact, incapable of intuiting the larger purpose or underlying tone behind a speech. Fielding's ability, as seen in the quotation, to respect statements for their mood as well as their truth, shows that he has learned cross-cultural lessons and can interact with Indians on their own standards rather than his own defined ones. That is very important, and there you find a contrast between Fielding and Aziz. This passage also highlights a problem with Adela's approach to India. Adela is still caught up with English literalism, even though she is well-meaning and her intellect Intelligent individualism sets her apart from the rest of the English. Without a capacity for sympathy or affectionate understanding, Adela cannot realize that she is evaluating Indians on her own terms rather than their terms. And there she matches Aziz's vision, and again contrasting with Fielding's vision of interaction with people. Adela's relationship with Aziz is, in this sense, without understanding or compassion, rather, it is somewhat materialistic. Adela wants to know the real India, and she expects Aziz to render it for her. This goal in itself is Adela's second mistake. Whereas she seeks a single India, the real India exists in hundreds of guises, and no single Indian can offer an entire sense of it. Okay, now the third important reference from the text, Miss Moore felt increasingly vision or nightmare that though people are important, the relations between them are not, and that in particular too much fuss has been made over marriage. Well, this quotation appears in the following chapters during the train ride to the Malabar caves. Foreshadows Mrs. Moore's upcoming crisis with the cave echo. Ever since setting foot in India, or more specifically, since hearing God Bole's religious song in chapter 7 or 8, Mrs. Moore has felt a spiritual presence larger than her own Christian God. So the question comes up, do we feel a kind of shift in Mrs. Moore's religious vision because of such experiences? Well, let's see. The largeness of this presence frightens Mrs. Moore and convinces her that human interactions are petty and meaningless. Her crisis at Malabar reinforces this feeling and leads her to paralyzing apathy. Mrs. Moore's vision, which shows that something larger than man encompasses the entire world and renders it equal, is a sort of negative version of God Bole's Hindu vision. The Hindu vision of the oneness of all living things finds comfort and joy in surrendering individual existence to the collective. Though Mrs. Moore takes this vision of impersonality to mean that human relationships are meaningless, the vision can also be liberating. Indeed, it is through a similar vision of impersonality and that Adela is able to realize that Aziz is innocent and that she must proclaim him so, regardless of the cost to her own person and reputation and future, and even her relationships with her own race and nationality. This passage also evinces Forster's subtle critique of the institution of marriage. Mrs. Moore and Fielding, both potential mouthpieces for Forster himself here, express distaste for marriage of such bond, specifically because it does not lead to a fruitful relationship that enlightens one about oneself or others. Few marriages exist in A Passage to India. Indeed, we witness the breakdown of two, Ronnie and Adela's, before it even starts, and the McBrides through adultery. As such, Forster implies that the English sentimentalize the domestic structure of husband, wife, and children. They view this structure as a scared symbol of all that is good about the British Empire, though the author contends that in reality, domestic situation can lead to trouble and ignorance. And the fourth reference from the text is, your emotions never seem in proportion to their objects, Aziz. Is emotion a sack of potatoes, so much the pond to be measured out? Am I a machine? Well, guess who is saying it? This exchange occurs in the almost last chapters as Aziz and Fielding's relationship begins to break down in the face of Fielding's new respect and advocacy for Adela. Though Aziz and Fielding have several misunderstandings during this time, their main conflict centers on the issue of reparation money from Adela. Aziz seeks damages from Adela in the aftermath of the trial, but Fielding believes that Adela should be given some credit for her bravery and truth and compassion rather than ruined financially as well. Fielding points out that Aziz loves Mrs. Moore, who has done nothing for Aziz, but begrudges Adela even after she has risked her own reputation and marriage to eventually pronounce Aziz innocent. Well, that Fielding has a point here. Aziz and Fielding's disagreement over this issue demonstrates the larger disparity between their worldviews. Fielding, who values logic and reason, sees Aziz as fickle and irrational because he bases his feeling on intuitions and connections that Fielding cannot see or understand. Aziz conversely sees Fielding as succumbing to the materialism and literalism of the rest of the English. Well, the two men often have lively conversations, but this quotation shows one new trend in their discussions. They directly disagree with each other and say so. Notably, Fielding is often the one who initially expresses dissatisfaction with Aziz's behavior or opinions. Fielding becomes more judgmental and less patient in the aftermath of the trial. This quotation also highlights the larger issue of British rule over India. Britain's control of India began initially as a capitalist venture with the British East India Company. As such, Britain appears to see itself as taking the muddle and inefficiency of India and turning it into an orderly, profitable capitalist system. Aziz objects to this kind of materialism, believing it values profit and efficiency over intangible matters of spirit and love. And this is the last quotation of today's talk. Were there worlds beyond which they could never touch, or did all that is possible enter their consciousness? They could not tell. Perhaps life is a mystery, not a muddle. Perhaps the 100 Indians which fuss and squabble so tiresomely are one, and the universe they mirror is one. They had not the apparatus for judging. In this quotation, which details Fielding and Adela's reaction to Adela's strange experience at Malabar Cave, Foster shows the inadequacy of English rationalism to evaluate mystical India. Adela is unable to articulate her frightening experience in the caves, even after her vision at the trial shows her Aziz's innocence. She and Fielding both approach the problem logically, attempting to outline a number of possible explanations: hallucination, the absence of the guide, and so on and so forth. Though Adela and Fielding are committed to rationally explaining the occurrence, each of their explanations falls short of Adela's experience. Here we begin to see that Adela's experience in the cave stands as a sort of synecdoche, a metaphor that takes a part for the whole. For the entire experience of the foreignness of India, like Malabar, India presents a confused set of stimulants, not all of which can be incorporated into a dominant explanation or interpretation. The only possible way to understand and classify the chaos of Malabar and India is to ascribe these mysteries to a force larger than humanity. A mystical force. Once mysticism is acknowledged, the muddle of Malabar becomes a mystery, and the strangeness of India comes to appear as a coherent whole. This passage also shows feeling and Aziz coming closer to each other through mutual respect and similar experience. Though Fielding does not like Adela for much of the novel, disagreeing with her theoretical and unemotional approach to Indians and India, the two do share a level of rationalism and non-spiritualism. Both are atheist in a way and cannot truly fathom mystical presence as Mrs. Moore can. Fielding begins to respect Adela for her frank objectivity and her willingness to admit that she is unable to explain what happened in the caves. Through conversations like this one, Adela and Fielding grow closer by acknowledging the strangeness of the India around them. Aziz senses that this is the tenure of Adela and Fielding's friendship, and he begins to resent Fielding for it. And this was all for the references from the text, and now we are starting with the characters from A Passage to India, starting with the very first character, and I hope that this is the only character we will be able to cover in today's talk, the character of Adela Quested, a very important character in the narrative. All fresh-faced, earnestness which she arrives in India with, Adela is perhaps the last person you would want to take along on a trip to the mall, let alone an exciting tour of India. For Adela seems to be a character who takes the cliché that your life is an open book, quite literally. She studies everything as if she were preparing for the SATs or of IELTS, as if there were vocabulary lists and formulas that could explain life, love, and human nature. So when Adela keeps talking about seeing the real India in the beginning of the novel, it is hard not to read that phrase as a desperate plea for help. A plea not just to see past the official sanitized version of British India, but also to escape her overly cerebral way of looking at the world. A plea to feel passionately, to really experience the world. India, Adela may know a lot of facts and figures about India, well-educated, progressive young woman that she is from England, but she doesn't know how to handle the mess and muddle of personal drama and interpersonal relationships. And we find Feeling as a contrast to her character. You could say that her traumatic experience in the caves might represent the culmination of a series of minor crises Adela undergoes in the novel as her cerebral self keeps getting smacked by her unpredictable emotional life. Particularly in her relationship with Ronnie, Adela is constantly puzzled over the fact that their interactions are so ordinary. There are no dramatic speeches, declarations of love, romantic letters, tears, embraces, and more tears, and more emotions, and more drama. There's just the touch of a hand in a car, and poof, they are engaged. Which brings us to the caves. What actually happens to Adela continues to be the subject of debate. Forster intentionally left that crucial narrative morsel out of the novel, and in Adela's explanation of what happened after the cave incident, she stresses that they never actually touched me once. He never actually touched me once. So what does this cave episode tell us about Adela? Well, given the clueless way she goes about thinking about love and marriage and emotion and drama, one way to look at the scene is to side with Fielding. Adela's situation is pathetic. Her whole charge against Aziz is just the hysterical fantasy of a silly, self-absorbed girl. She may have been attacked, but the attack was a hallucination driven by her need for drama in some, I would say, some active wave in her dull life, by her disappointment with how bored she is with travel and with her love life. Well, her discussion with Aziz right before this incident regarding his wife can also be a reason for this drama, or maybe a need for this drama. Well, you could be even more cynical, as some critics are, and suggest that the fact that she's thinking about India and love right before she enters the cave indicates that her attack is an erotic fantasy, driven by a sexual attraction to Aziz that would have been unthinkable to act on in that time. Quite a cynical statement though. Perhaps, or you could follow Fielding one step further. Even Fielding realizes that he was a little hard on Adela, and he's struck by her sincerity in their conversation after the trial. While the rest of the Anglo-Indians went nuts with racial hysteria, Adela was in a way saved by her own dispassionate way of looking at things, the very quality that made her such a pathetic product of Western education in the first place. We will never know what actually happened in the cave, but it's useful to keep in mind Fielding's thought that after the trial, Adela was no longer examining life but being examined by it. She had become a real person. As her name implies, Adela is no longer on a quest but being quested. The stress is no longer on the real India but on Adela as a real person. Does the novel really give Adela a chance to become a real person? Your answer to that question depends on how you fill in the gap in the cave. And this was all about today's talk as well. However, what we could do in today's talk includes our discussion on the last bit of theme that was left, and we had some critical questions following this thematic discussion. We also brought in symbolism, imagery and allegory in our discussion, and we continued our talk on critical questions coming out of that discussion. We took some statements from the text as references and discussed them for your convenience to use them in your explanations in order to substantiate your answers. And we started with our character discussion, and our very first character that we discussed in today's talk was Adela Quested. I hope that in the coming lecture we will be able to finish all of them. And then we will start our series of revision of all the text and authors that we could cover in this semester in modern novel. So this was all for today's talk. I'll see you in the next lecture, lecture 29. Allah Hafiz.